Good afternoon. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to acknowledge that our conversation is being held virtually on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of our communities who may be here today. I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri and Boomerang Land. I'm Melissa Bianca Amore, the lead curator for the Conversation series, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Melbourne Art Fair. We are delighted to present the panel discussion, Local Global, Redefining the Terms. This panel discussion asks, how do we understand the complexities and the integration between local and global contexts? The new landscape of interactivity, accelerated by the global pandemic, has prompted a re-evaluation of the term globalisation, making the art world readdress notions of proximity and distance, as well as re-examining cross-cultural discourses and the reflexive return to local communities. Join leading art curators, museum directors and artists in an international dialogue from Indonesia, Australia and Hong Kong, discussing critical questions about the future space of art. Where is the local located? What is the role and responsibility of the local in the global? And how do we address the speculative nature of cultural agency and national identity? To moderate the discussion is renowned curator Alexi Glass-Cantor. Alexi Glass is a curator, cultural producer and advocate for the arts. She Executive Director of Art Space Sydney, Curator Encounters Section for Art Basel Hong Kong, and Curator for artist Marco Fisanato for La Biennale di Venezia 2022. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome a dear friend and colleague, Alexi Glass-Cantor, to moderate this panel discussion for the Melbourne Art Fair. Welcome, Alexi.
Thank you, and good afternoon everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm privileged to be here in Nam, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'm very privileged to live and work on the lands of the Gadigal people. This is an amazing discussion, the local and the global, redefining the term, and we have, as Melissa said, speakers who are coming to us from Jakarta, from Mianjin up in Brisbane. We have speakers who are coming to us from Kathmandu and also from Jakarta, which I mentioned a moment ago. I would like to introduce our speakers before I kind of go into a bit of an introduction for today's discussion. What we're going to do is try and unpack ideas. We have 5 really remarkable speakers, and I've got Ramesh Marionithendran, who's just pulled up his seat beside me. I'll introduce the speakers in a moment, but we do have Cosmin Kostinas, Aaron Sito, Nina Mal, Kimberly Moulton, Ramesh Marionithendran. What we want to talk about is how to redefine the terms of the local and the global, and we need to acknowledge in this conversation that these two concepts indeed are interchangeable. We're operating in a global context right now on Zoom, but we don't want to focus on COVID and the pandemic. In a sense, the past 2 years has accelerated a necessary instrumentalization of using digital platforms as a parallel sibling to the way in which we construct and produce programming, both in virtual but also physical and material contexts. Today's conversation is really about how we can think about hybridity and how we can think about potentiality. We want to anchor this conversation in thinking about what are the ethics and principles of working in local and global contexts. 20 years ago, the idea of the global village was that the edges would become the center and the center would become the edges. But what actually happened was that we found out that every context has its depths, its histories, its agencies, its efficacies, its own touchstones, its own narratives that have value and worth and that create versions of subjectivity and identity that are as layered and nuanced, and in contact with one another, these things don't create singular linear narratives of encounter, but instead create potential for more complexity, more layered and depth of engagement. So really for me, the conversation about the local and the global is about how we don't move back from complexity, but how we lean in to safe spaces for risk and experimentation, facilitate encounters in a local and global context, how we support and scaffold the complexities of artistic production, and how when you take the context or specificity of production from one context into contact with another, what are your responsibilities as artists, as institutions, as interlocutors, as facilitators, and as participants? Something that's really important when I think about global is a tricky term for this panel and was one that sat uncomfortably for me. I felt that global sort of sits more within a kind of neoliberal agenda, a kind of global economy of trade and commodification of culture. And thinking more today and potentially about the idea of the transnational, which is in its sense also a very kind of tricky topic, and intersectionality layered on top of the transnational as well, connecting to forms of diaspora, migration, and the riptides of kind of how we might connect, and that things, again, in terms of the specificities of localities, are often dislodged and can exist in parallel in more than one place. All of the participants in today's panel are skilled and extraordinary advocates working to think about the ethics of how complex cultural content can engage not just in the site of production, but with audiences beyond. Cosmin Costinas, born in Romania, living till recently, well, still living in Hong Kong as the executive director of Parasite, is today coming to us from Kathmandu, where he is in Nepal about to open the Kathmandu Biennial, and it has just been announced as the curator for the Romanian Pavilion at La Biennale di Venezia this year, which is fantastic. Aaron Sito is the director of the Museum Macan in Jakarta. He was formerly the director of 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art in Sydney and a former head of Asian and Pacific Art at Quag Goma, and that's the institution where we now have Nina Mile, who is based there as the curator of international art. Nina was based in London for 12 years and has been here in Australia and done an incredible amount of work in thinking about strategies of decolonisation and deterritorialisation in relationship to survey shows such as the National, and curator at Carriage Works and the Tarawara Biennial as an independent curator. Kimberly Moulton is a fantastic friend and collaborator. I had the great privilege of travelling with her to Bangladesh 4 years ago to participate in the Sovereign Words project with the Office for Contemporary Art Norway, bringing together 24 First Nations participants from four continents to talk about new models and forms of Indigenous knowledge and leadership in a global context. And that was also the project where we presented Ramesh Murray and Nithyanjan. But Kimberly has been working extensively in her role through Museums Melbourne as a curator with archives and collections of objects, particularly those taken from First Nations communities, and responsibilities of care and processes that are required when thinking about what the global means in terms of institutional ethics, accountability, and accessibility. And it's wonderful to have an incredible Yorta woman and such a powerful cultural leader with us here today. And Ramesh is here with me in the studio in real life. The remarkable kind of extraordinary gift of this week has been meeting people again after years of us all being sequestered in our bedrooms. So it's beautiful to be here in this set and to be able to lead the conversation with Ramesh. His beautiful, fecund and fervent artistic practice trawls a range of references through history to produce unpredictable forms and materials that embody a shape-shifting way of representing subjectivity, representation, and contact with ideas through time. And I think the way that his work speculatively inhabits both a personal and physical space and materiality really asks us about what a borderless practice looks like, both ontologically and materially. So moving on from that, I just do want to say personally that I'm not expecting us to achieve a redefining of terms today. For me, that's not the end game. We recently, in my role at Artspace, curated a show in Korea, a survey of Australian art called Unlearning Australia in Korean, Rediscover the Rouge. And for me, that is about how we must constantly rethink and lean into being uncomfortable. Today's conversation can be uncomfortable. We are talking about ideas that need to evolve through time. We're not talking about fixed lines of the social, cultural, and political in a local or global context. How can we lean into our vulnerability in order to maintain accountability and ethics to the communities that we work with and collaborate for? So, with that, I'm going to move into our first speaker. Each speaker is going to present a 5-minute proposition on the topic from their own positionality. The first speaker who will be coming to you today is Kimberly. I do just want to say with Kimberly that she's, I mentioned before that she's a senior curator of Southeast and Aboriginal collections at Museums Victoria. She's also the Associate Artistic Director for Rising Festival. She works at the front and intersection of First Peoples histories and contemporary art. She's held curatorial and community arts development roles at the Melbourne Museum for over 10 years. And in 2018, she was the Melbourne Victoria lead curator for Mandala My Life in partnership with the Nelson Mandela Foundation in Johannesburg and the IEC exhibitions. And in 2021, she was the co-curator for the inaugural Tri-Nations Indigenous Triennial at Winnipeg Art Gallery. And we caught up and spoke about this the other night. And she has some really beautiful reflections on that project that I hope she'll share today. And also To Draw Water, In 2021, Kimberly developed the project Moving Objects with Rising Festival, which is a framework for sustained collection access with contemporary artists, supporting the transformative potential that museum collections can have with community and critically engaging in themes of regeneration, disruption and renewal. Independently, Kimberly has curated across various art institutions in Australia and written for publications worldwide. And Kimberly is a PhD candidate in curatorial practice at Monash University, Melbourne. Over to you, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Alexi. What a wonderful introduction and many exciting ideas to talk about. Where is the local located? For me, the local is located, right now I'm sitting on Wurundjeri country. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bunwurrung and the Wurundjeri, where the Melbourne Art Fair is located as well. The local for me also, I'm a Yorta Yorta woman. So in my positionality as a Yorta Yorta woman as a guest on Aboriginal land in Melbourne, I think about, what that means in terms of traditional ownership. Wherever we are in the world, there are First Peoples. There are people that have cared for and continue to connect to that land. In my work, it takes me across the southeast of Australia. I work across the collection, 5,000 objects of ancestral belongings, right through to contemporary works that come from across what we now know as New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia. But this also takes me across the nation and, in fact, globally. Alexia, you mentioned the amazing Dark Art Summit and the critical writing ensemble that we were a part of. And I got to be there with incredible peers from Australia, mentors and leaders in the arts, Indigenous art writing, such as Daniel Browning and John Mundine. And I was also there with incredible minds from all around the world. So First Nations people from Canada, from Sapmi communities in Norway, from Bangladesh. And it was an incredible kind of way to think about our commonalities and our shared experiences as First Peoples, but also how diverse and how really different our experiences are at the same time. But at that time, we were talking, and with the outcome, which was Sovereign Words, the book, David Garneau, who is a Métis artist and curator and extraordinary scholar, wrote an essay where he talks about the global Indigenous and these sort of layers and relationships that we have as Indigenous people globally. So I think, when I'm thinking about what is local to me, or where's the local located, rather, wherever I am in the world, I am always thinking about the First Peoples. I think my first experience of working internationally was around 2014. I stayed in Charlottesville for a little while, and I was part of a international fellowship with the National Gallery of Australia and the Wesfarmers Indigenous Leadership Program. And I was curating a show of Jambawa Marawili, who's a senior Yolngu leader from Northeast Arnhem Land. And it was a huge honour to work with his work and his barks. And I was curating in an Australian Aboriginal art museum in Virginia, in America, on Monacan country, so that they are the native peoples, First Peoples of the Charlottesville area. And there were many layers I wanted to consider, in terms of locating myself on Monacan country as a Yorta Yorta person, working with the incredible artwork of Jambawa Marawili from Northeast Arnhem Land, and making those connections to the First Peoples of where I was living and working. So I don't know where I could go on and on and on, but I think my 5 minutes is probably up. But I suppose this provocation of what is local and where is it located, first and foremost for me, it's always with the First Peoples of the lands that I am living and working.
I think, Kimberly, it is really important. We are on the unceded sovereign lands of Aboriginal people. There were over 300 language and countries on this place before the British came and declared terra nullius, one of the most profound human rights violations that you can actually ever imagine. And there's a huge amount of work to be done in terms of, over the past 20 years, it's been a remarkable transformation in Australia to say the name of country, to acknowledge country. There is a change happening in the recognition of the fact that this is unceded land. But how do you, I suppose, just in your own practice, working, understanding as a Yorta Yorta woman, working across the complexities of this context, the local is something very specific and complicated here, and then you work in a global context. How do you constantly work and rethink? How's your practice evolved over the past 10 years in relationship to language and place and acknowledgement of processes of care as a curator?
I think it's very grounding for me working within a cultural context of ancestral belonging, so the historical archive. I work across space, I work obviously within Melbourne Museum and in that space, but I also have a practice in contemporary curatorial work and contemporary Indigenous art practice. And what I'm interested in is that intersection and that meeting point and the transformative potential that the archive can have to contemporary practice. And I think what's changed in my work over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, like working within that space, is having a continually deeper understanding of the cultural protocol, the cultural importance of historical archive with elders, with community, and building on access and building on, the relationships between the object and the living community it comes from and the land that it comes from. So this is very grounding for me. I think there's been huge sort of light bulb moments having international opportunities and having the space to talk with other Indigenous peers across the world. And like I said, with our time in Bangladesh, and we have lots of similarities and parallels to our histories and in terms of the colonization of our countries and kind of moving through that. But I guess sort of unpacking what that means for me in Australia. And sometimes I have to leave Australia and I have to leave, where's comfortable and what I know to experience other things and kind of extend that thinking. So I think having international opportunities and working with other First Peoples from across the world has been really influential in my thinking, and even my thinking around ideas of decolonization and, do I believe that anymore? And, like it's changed over the last 10 years constantly, which I think is, a good thing.
I think it's absolutely correct, and I think when when Melbourne Art Fair invited me to participate and facilitate this panel and the speakers who came today, I think something that I was very conscious of, and I think there's a beautiful publication that if anyone's interested you can order it from the Office for Contemporary Art in Norway, which is an incredible organisation working with the Sami and Indigenous reindeer people of the Arctic Circle, Sovereign Words, in which Kimberly contributed a really remarkable essay that I think is feeding into her PhD, which will hopefully become a book itself. But that idea of constantly leaning into the fact that there is no fixed term, that these things have to constantly evolve. And just before I move on to the next speaker, it'd be great just to hear a little bit, because I think it'll be relevant as I move to Cosmin, to hear a little bit about how you worked on the recent inaugural Tri-Nations Indigenous Triennial in Winnipeg, which you had to curate in a pandemic and at a distance, and working with First Nations collaborators in a global context. And what were the things that you took into that that were great kinds of foundations, and what shifted and changed for you in that process?
Yeah, so that project started really in probably 2018. I was fortunate enough to be part of the Australia Council for the Arts International Indigenous Exchange Program. And we went to Canada, Turtle Island, and we're in Winnipeg for a little while, and we went to the Future Imaginaries conference in Winnipeg. And then we travelled with a cohort of Indigenous curators from Australia, New Zealand, Sami, and from Turtle Island across Canada, then really having really kind of rigorous space to workshop ideas, to connect to each other, to critique institutions and galleries. And so that was really, really important and influential time for me. And I met Jamie Isaacs, who's an Anishinaabe curator based in Winnipeg, and she's now chief curator in British Columbia, but at the art gallery there. But so we met and we just had a really aligned kind of practice and understanding about things. And so in 2019, she approached me around doing a show together, but also bringing in Ruben Friend, who is, well, at the time was the director of Pataka Museum, who was also on that tour with us. And then also Joanna Gordon-Smith, who is a curator at Pataka as well. And so we formed a curatorial collective and started workshopping on this idea of Nadobe, which is actually an Anishinaabe term for to draw water, which was gifted to us by Jamie's grandmother. And it's around the connections that First Peoples have to water, that women have as water carriers and matriarchs of that space, and also our connections to land and the conversations that were happening between, you know, New Zealand, Turtle Island, and Australia, Aotearoa, what we now know as Australia and Turtle Island. And so coming together, we did get to come together in real life. We were actually in Sydney for Brooke Entry's Biennale a few years ago, and we're really excited and had all these plans to kind of travel and bring the artists together and workshop. And then, you know, the world changed a few weeks later. And so we had to shift and rethink this, because we still wanted this opportunity for the artists. That was really important. And we shifted our thinking. We brought together artists from each of our countries, and worked. It took 2 years to get it up, and you know, it was amazing. Jamie, you know, we had to be installing via Zoom. We're all familiar with this now, but I guess it was a challenge because I wanted the artists to be able to connect. I think these international programs are so important, or even when we're working internationally, like for us all to get in the same room and have yarns and connect. And that's what was missing. And so I guess I'm really proud of the outcome. I think the show had, you know, really big audience attendance over in Winnipeg. It was on for 6 months. It just finished last week, and now we're kind of talking around touring iterations, and the catalogue's coming out soon and everything. But I think that the fact that we could still come together, even though it was via Zoom, and that we could bring the physical works together in that space in Winnipeg, really meant something. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No,
Alexi,
it does. And I think it does actually speak to the fact that in going forward, there is a new opportunity in the next kind of 10, 20 years to be using those parallel platforms of digital and physical encounter as, you know, counterparts, and as, you know, collaborative ways of creating speculative space of encounter, and that connection, that kind of vulnerability that comes from being intimate in space as bodies in a place speaking with one another, but also the potential that can still exist when we can use digital platforms as a way to create connection like we are today, and to curate these kinds of exhibitions is really important. And I suppose with that I'll move to you, Cosmin, in Kathmandu right now. And I wouldn't usually read bios, and I will just say to the speakers today that my speakers are on this side of me on the left and the camera's on the right, which is why I'm looking a little bit left and right. But usually I say that bios are for Google, and if you want to know about the speakers, you should look them up. But I do think in the context of this conversation, it is actually important to say what they do. So I will quickly just say that Cosmin is a Romanian-born writer and curator, has been the executive director of Parasite since 2011. During his tenure, the institution underwent a major expansion, which I got to witness as the curator for Asia for Art Basel Hong Kong, and tremendous transformation under his leadership, and relocation to its current venue in the Wingmar Industrial Building. Beyond running Parasite, Cosmin was the guest curator at the Dakar Biennial in Senegal 2018, the curator of the Dhaka Art Summit 2018, co-curator, and guest curator of the 10th Shanghai Biennial 2014. He is an advisory board member of Pat and Ernst Foundation in Vienna, a transnational program that supports contemporary culture, and a contributing editor of the magazines Art, Ideas and Society and Version, Asia's first outset curator of contemporary art. He has curated to numerous magazines and publications, and I actually met him when Documenta 12 was happening, and he was working on the publications programs. We met many, many years ago under Roger Bruegel's edition of Documenta. So we've had a very long friendship, and Cosmin lives and works in a range of different places, and this week he's in Nepal opening his Kathmandu Biennial. You should tell us the title and the concept and the environment in which you're in right now, Cosmin, and how all of that has worked. Over to you. Can you turn your mic on, darling?
Sorry. Very much, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be speaking alongside great colleagues who I followed and respected. Some of them met in person, some of them only from a distance. So it's a really great pleasure. And apologize in advance if the internet will be unstable. I'm trying to be on the best sort of like possible network, but yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, I would like to start by echoing what Kimberly said. I think the global is essentially, or the one that you choose to be. And networks of solidarity, networks of commonality are to be found within this otherwise complicated category of the global. Indeed, we're not going to redefine terms or get lost into semantics. And just to point out that, of course, there has been a history of indeed trying to coin the most appropriate terms for connection, collectivity, and exchanges across communities and across borders that are not necessarily circumscribed to this very loaded neoliberal term of the global. We don't have to, necessarily like waste time of doing that, but it's important to mention that indeed there are many ways in which one can find one's peers, colleagues, and sources of support around the world. And speaking now from the perspective of the Kathmandu Triennale, this was like particularly urgent here. And Nepal is, as I'm sure you're familiar, a young republic that was established following revolutionary war led by indigenous struggles that overthrew the monocultural monarchy that was in place until 2005. So it's a unique context in the world through this recent political history and how conversations and struggles about indigenous issues, both in terms of economic and land rights and in terms of like cultural rights, are at the forefront of constitutional negotiations of the country. So from this particular vantage point, and together with my colleagues and curators Shilash Rajbandari and Hidman Gurung, it was actually crucial to imagine the Triennale as a platform for dialogue and exchanges with artists and activists from communities around the world. Ultimately, I think this led to a different conversation of what the international means in the Nepali context, because the Triennale itself was established as a platform for internationalizing the Nepali art scene, but that has been an ongoing conversation of like, what are the worlds that one connects with? What are the communities? What are the artists? What are the vantage points that one feels solidarity with? What kind of worlds are being ultimately presented in the exhibition spaces here? The title itself is, I think, has become a multi-signifier more than we actually intended. The Triennale was supposed to open at the end of 2020, in December 2020, Common Era. And our decision earlier on was to rename it and to claim the one of the indigenous times of the time counting method in the Nepali context, which placed the Triennale in the year 2077. That itself was an assumed critical decision, because there are a lot of struggles and hierarchies within indigenous contexts in Nepal. There are different counting time methods and different calendars that are competing, and they come from different communities that have been in different relationships of hierarchy with each other. So that was also a decision that assumed that that there will be like a whole conversation about these relations of power within indigenous context in Nepal. Nevertheless, with the pandemic that fell upon us all, the Triennale shifted away from 2020, away from 2077. It is happening now in the year 2022 in the Common Era, and the year 2079 in the Nepali calendar. But we decided to keep the name, to keep 2077 as a mark of a time that functions outside of history, of a time that acknowledges the many disjunctions and disconnects between our intentions, and here I would say also like intentions of decolonizing our set of references, and the realities of entrenched power and the reality of forces that are often beyond our control. And we also kept 2077 as an acknowledgement of the pandemic itself and of the huge disruption and loss of life that it had brought in many parts of the world and in many communities within countries in the world. And we all know that the pandemic has often disproportionately affected indigenous communities and migrant communities in many countries around the world. And with this, I would also like, for the sake of our conversation, to bring another point, and that is the pandemic itself and how it affected our sense of local and global. I think after, many of us have been communicating with any form of community through our computers and our phones, the proximity of the community that forms the local has dissolved into a broader sense of global proximity and solidarities with people around the world, as well as the sort of shared experience of the pandemic, which of course, again, has affected people differently, but has nevertheless been a global event. So I think the kind of conversation that we would have had in 2019, and of course, there is a history of conversation about the tension between these terms, needs to be revisited and redefined post-pandemic. If I'm also thinking about my context of Hong Kong, where borders have been closed, and the regime of traveling in and out of Hong Kong has been even harsher than Australia's, and it still is, and this has overlapped with a huge devolving of political liberties. This has certainly contributed to the imagination of the local as a claustrophobic reality of isolation. So both in the context of Hong Kong and I think the broader global context post-pandemic, the need to sort of like reconnect beyond borders becomes an renewed urgency. But of course, it needs to happen alongside what I mentioned earlier, and what Kimberly laid out so powerfully. It needs to happen alongside one's own networks of solidarity and one's own principles of well-being and understanding where your world lies and which are the different worlds that you want to bring together. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Cosmin. And I think bringing up Hong Kong at this point, and obviously the current political context and the zero COVID policy being pursued by Beijing and the way it's instrumentalizing that as a strategy for suppression of freedom of speech and other civil liberties in the context of China and its relationship particularly to Hong Kong and increasingly and as we can predict in the future, with greater force in relationship to Taiwan, and also as it currently exists in relationship to Tibet, are really troubling, and particularly also up in the Xinjiang province. And the way that COVID has been instrumentalized as a strategy to close borders and to create a kind of insularity. And even in Australia, you know, there were conversations that happened through the pandemic with funders, and there was group kind of conversations and consultation with what we call stakeholders with different government agencies, where people would say, well, maybe now's the time to forget about an international strategy for Australia. Maybe we just focus on keeping everything here. You know, it's really not a time, I think, at a time where borders are closed, is not the time to close your ideas and your imagination and the potential for contact and reaching out. And I suppose, Cosmin, you've worked over the years with a lot of artists from Australia, artists like Daniel Boyd, Taloy Havini, Rainbow Chan. You've worked with artists from Aotearoa and from across the Pacific, and projects like your Bark Cloth project. How are you thinking in the context of Nepal, just quickly before I move to Ramesh, about how to speak to the works of artists that are coming from different contexts in the context that you're in? And how do you continue to work on projects where you are taking content that has very specific cultural significant resonance and ethics in the place in which it's produced, and support those when artists or communities can't be there to speak for themselves? And how do you integrate and build in the language of those communities so that that is ethically recognized?
Thank you. It's an important question. We do have, I think, 5 Australian artists in the Triennale. They are all Aboriginal, from different Aboriginal communities. Of course, the crucial part of curating in this way is not to see exhibition making as moving objects around from artist studios to exhibition spaces, from countries to countries. This is primarily a process of dialogue, of creating meaning for both parts of this exchange, and all done under ethical principles. One example is artist Julia Gray, originally from Papua New Guinea, who has developed a practice of working with body marking, women body marking from across Melanesia, and attempts at reviving the practice that was suppressed under colonial and evangelist pressure, actually, like across the Pacific. So she has developed a unique practice of establishing bonds and connections with the women that she ultimately engages with in the process of body marking. In different communities in the south of Nepal, there has also been a process of alongside political repression of the Taro community, there has been a process of both imposed and sort of like self abandonment for under great duress of traditions of body marking, which would have been signifiers of one's belonging to a community. And there are different activists who have actually advocated for finding new ways of bringing back this lineage of body markings, but in connection to political structures and struggles and economic struggles of the community as well. So we organized several, sadly, online workshops between Julia and the activists. Our initial plan was to have like Julia on the ground, and there were several plans that would have led to different individuals being body marked. We also decided at the end not to do it, given the Zoom reality. So and given the importance of in real life context for such an intimate and powerful and sacred process. So I think it was also the importance of letting things go that after a process proved not to be feasible. But the process itself and the workshops have actually led to a lot of exchanges and a lot of even like concrete results in the dialogue. And Julia has had actually like a great impact on the work of several activists. So I think, yeah.
I think that's, I mean, I think what's great there is that importance of how process can lead to contact through a process of exploring the potential of what exists, but also being prepared to make decisions to not do things, you know, when it can't land. And I think that is part of working locally and globally, is kind of understanding that you can initiate processes, but sometimes you have to make the decision that you've made contact and created contacts and networks and opportunities for engagement, but perhaps what you thought the end point was isn't necessarily the end. I'm an undisciplined moderator today. I think I'm just going to flag that this talk may go 10 or 15 minutes over time, just because it's fine for the IT guys say it's fine, so just for the audience, but just because there is so much to unpack in this, and I think it is really important to get these layers right. And so I will go, I think Cosman's internet may have gone down. He's in Kathmandu today. It's a little bit tricky with the internet, and also Aaron has tricky internet in Jakarta. But I'm going to go to Ramesh in real life beside me, a human who's here in the room. And I will just say that, you know, Ramesh, for many of you, you know his work for, if you're an Australian audience, but also a global audience, a Sri Lankan-born contemporary artist who explores global histories and languages of figurative representation with specific interests in South Asian forms and imagery, as well as politics relating to idolatry, the monument, gender, race, and religiosity, while he's best known for his irreverent approach to ceramic media. His material vernacular includes bronze, concrete, neon, LED, fiberglass, as well as conventional painting and printmaking techniques. His show last year that happened at Sullivan and Strumpf when we came out of the lockdown was a highlight of my November, and made me so happy to see living, fervent, kind of life-affirming fuck-off work just filling a space made during an incredible time of isolation. You know, he's had exhibitions with the National Gallery of Australia, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Dhaka Art Summit, Art Basel Hong Kong, Dark Mofo. He's represented in almost every major state and territory collection in Australia. But I do also want to just mention today that he has work presented in the largest historical survey of LGBTQI Asian art at the Bangkok Art and Cultural Centre, and was recently included in the Thames and Hudson book 100 Sculptors of Tomorrow. And I think participating in the kind of Bangkok exhibition at a distance is one that's good to talk about today too. So Ramesh, over to you.
Thanks, Alexi.
Yes.
It's really amazing to sit and to connect and speak to everybody. I think there are a lot of the times there were real misinterpretations about what artists' lives might actually look like, and I think a lot of the time it's quite lone, it's quite solitary. So these moments of being able to speak to people, even in these kinds of online interfaces and together in person, is really amazing. But with that said, I'd like to also acknowledge that something that's really pertinent to me making work in Australia is that I'm making work in a context that has an unfathomable history of learning, teaching, making, and creative practices. And any artwork made in these places are really just, you know, in line with the most, I guess, sophisticated, you know, creative practices and thinking and ideas around nurturing. And I think it's a really generative thing. You know, I think the kind of immensity of creativity in the land in which we're standing on is inspiring, and it makes working in this place as well an amazing thing to think about. Kind of taking a little trip down memory lane, but less down memory lane, the first time I met you, Alexi, was the 2014 New South Wales Visual Arts Fellowship at ArtSpace, and that was your first stint as, the first show as your stint as director of ArtSpace. And I remember I just kind of graduated from university and presented this installation, and I was working at a time where I just come out of art school, and I thought because I didn't make videos, I would never have a career. I was working with really tactile practices. I was working with painting. I was working expressionistically, and just in this kind of my immediate context, I was like 26, and I didn't really know of art worlds beyond my local community. And I didn't see myself reflected in those spaces, and I didn't feel welcome. So I never, you know, really understood how I could actually develop some kind of career that was rooted in any way in the kinds of experiences and references that I was interested in. And I think reflecting back on that experience, which is now 7 years later, I'm really suspicious of language that gets circulated in the art world. And I don't mean that in a antagonistic kind of way. It's just that terms like local and global, often terms that exist in manners that might be oppositional or might have roots in some kind of binary, and which is what we're doing here, I think need to be unpacked. And something that I often do when I'm thinking about terms is think through the etymology of the terms. Where do these terms come from, and what were their roots, and why are we using them now? And interestingly, local, locus, Latin, means has meant pertaining to a specific place, but it was also used in medicine, where we were talking about how certain things can relate to specific parts of the body. And I think that's really interesting, that kind of shift and understanding in which we can actually think about individual bodies and then start thinking about broader transnational, international, and global communities. And the interesting thing about global and a lot of the definitions around the global is that the term universal keeps coming up. It's almost this fantasy, universal. Is there a universal condition? How can we strive for a universal condition? Do we even need a universal condition? And I think the fact that we often use these terms together means that we want to understand place in ways that are reflective of 2021 and reflective in the way in which we as individuals and communities are moving through the world. But I guess my position here is as an artist. And I thought, what can I actually contribute to this discussion as a proposition or a provocation in terms of studio practice? And that's really what I do every day. I practice, I make work in my studio. And one thing I thought could be interesting to reflect on was something I was thinking about today. So I currently have a show that's open at Javeri Contemporary in Mumbai called The Mud and the Rainbow. And then I was thinking, where are my works at the moment? You know, where are they in the globe? Where do they exist? And I currently have one work at the entrance of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is a multi-limbed bronze figure. It's the first thing you see when you walk in. And then I thought, I currently also have work in Mumbai. And what am I thinking? How can I think through these things? And something that really came to me was, and Kimberly, you were kind of talking about this as well, working with archives, working with collections, and actually thinking through the way in which collection items have actually been situated and placed in different contexts. And something, when I was working on my commission for the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which was placed in the vestibule, which is their entrance space, people can't enter any other way, they said to me, do you want to work with some items in the collection? And I thought, you know, that's interesting, you know, as an artist. And something just, you know, through my Googling, through my immediate research came up, was this idea that within this context, non-white artists are often given this burden of institutional critique. You know, there's this idea that, I'm speaking in inverted commas, that we're in this kind of, that museums are these kinds of neo-colonial spaces with lots of potential. How can we actually reimagine, re-envision, and re-energize collections to actually allow readings that are more relevant, that are more ethical? And I thought to myself, what are the things in the collection of this state institution that actually really excite me? And I thought, I'm going to look through in a way that is open. And I'm a Tamil Sri Lankan person. My parents migrated to Australia as refugees, and something as a child which I always gravitated towards were Hindu iconography. And we weren't religious or anything, but there was something I always felt reflected in those works. And I think it was the kind of plurality and the multiplicity of narratives within Hindu mythology, and also the multiplicity in the formality. Literally lots of arms, lots of legs, lots of colours. And that's a kind of almost naive, innocent perspective in terms of how I think through those things. But the two objects I chose to place as central items in my installation were a Javanese Ganesh and a Gandharan Buddha. And those two works for me I found to be so creatively inspiring because they were they developed through contact between different cultures. So it was a time where, so the Gandharan Buddha and when Alexander the Great kind of moved through northwest Pakistan, and these Buddhist sculptures started to have elements of, Grecian aspects. And with the Javanese Ganesh, I was really interested in this idea that this very specific type of Ganesh was specific to Indonesia, and emerged from this kind of Hindu enclave. And they were kind of flagging my installation as the central items. And I was really thinking to myself, how can I see my sculptures as part of a continuum of a whole range of artistic vernaculars that have emerged through time? And what I actually realized through the audience's encounter with these objects that were from, close neighbors geographically, was that they perceived them to be very local in that term. I remember during my installation, Diwali was on, Indian Festival of the Lights, and the amount of people and family that went through that actually, understood the way in which those items were placed in those installations as more of a celebratory gesture, really made me realize that the way we actually think through these terms has real world effects. It affects how we present exhibitions in terms of how they look. And even just as an artist, the colors I use, the forms I make, I'm constantly thinking about those terms. And also, I'd like to end on, is I'm also trying to often think about how to speak about my work and construct a framework around my work that is beyond kind of hot terms that are happening in the art world at the moment. And I'm not saying that local and global are. I think we're here because we understand that those terms are used and they need to be, I guess, unpacked. But something that I often do is I'm very careful about the language I use, and terms like local and global are terms I choose not to use.
They give me a rash.
Yeah.
They really. When I was asked to put together this public program today, and I was fortunate that MAF gave me the trust to select the panel of speakers. I mean, I had a real problem with the title of this panel because those words are they're so reductive, they're so binary, and your practice is one of radical rethinking of the non-binary specificity of the layered and contradictory meanings that can be held in one form, in one idea, in one object, that nothing is kind of singular. And I think your practice from when we first met in 2014 and the range and references and the speculative forms that you were beginning to bring together in your practice that are finding fruition, there is a deliberateness in your work that I think people miss. There is also a kind of underlying kind of seriousness of purpose in terms of challenging a kind of linearity of the way in which we speak about specificities of representation or performances of type. And I do think there is something to be said about the way that institutions at the moment, as a form of kind of whitewashing and laundering the institution's colonial histories and structures of power, try to instrumentalize artists and curators of First Nations or culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds to work with the archive, to work with collections in a way that almost, allows the institution to still perpetuate to do things over on the side while it foregrounds what you do over here that they've, legitimized through the commissioning of particular interventions. And that's a real kind of that responsibility that then sits with artists like yourself to then be asked by the institution to do something that might seem radical but is actually kind of in a sense reductive. And how do you work within those sorts of spaces?
I think like it's a great honor to work with archives and collections. You're working with objects that you have great responsibility to think through those things. And what I've found really inspiring, I think, like I only finished art school like 6 years ago, is that what I've discovered about the central aspect of being able to work with these with I guess exhibition making, even as a discourse, is it's actually conversation that is the main thing. It's kind of the WhatsApping, it's the emails, it's the phone calls about very minute and specific details I've found that have actually allowed the works to change and to morph. And even just this notion of flexibility and immediate responsiveness I find to be really integral to exhibition making for me. Because a lot of the time, if we're mocking something up on CAD, and we're working with all these works, when we actually place them in the space, when we actually erect the thing, the actual experiential or phenomenological or register of the things change. So I feel like I'm really fortunate to have worked with really amazing people like you, Alexi, and I'd like to acknowledge that we worked on my first kind of major international presentation together for Dhaka Art Summit that then went to Art Basel Hong Kong, and that was a really kind of key moment for me in my work and my thinking.
I will say that something that was important in that, and something that is worth acknowledging in the context here, that's not often spoken about publicly, is that as artists and curators working together, we have to make choices. And your work does have a strong aspect of LGBTQI, sex positive affirmation. And we were presenting in Bangladesh, which is an Islamic state. It's a country that's broken, you know, you were born in Sri Lanka, and we had to think about how not to muffle or censor the kind of sexuality and the message of kind of radical kind of libertarianism that runs through your work in a deep and important and powerful way but also respect that context. And that's a negotiation that always requires, I think, a conversation, again, about not assuming anything about the context in which you are working, whether you are there in person or whether you are there remotely. There are conditions and responsibilities about understanding how you make work that doesn't compromise the integrity and urgency of the work, but also pays respect to understanding that the audience may read it through their own lens and how things can be misinterpreted, or you know, that kind of sense or absence of responsibility or care. Because when you think about etymology, the Latin term for curate is curare, to care, and it shouldn't be paternalistic, it should be open. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
I think that's a perfect thing to say, and I think something that I've been interested in as well is this idea of iteration as an artist, and how we can actually, you know, I think with my work there's sometimes this kind of tension. You know, when I think of the true meaning of the word obscenity, it's kind of heightened display. And, you know, we could argue that like a formal element of my work is obscenity. And I think as I'm a little bit older and a bit more confident, I feel it's almost like the sexual symbolism is almost in the intensity of the work and in the application of materials, less so in the kind of immediate recognizable symbols. And I'm basically dancing around the word, the fact that I kind of make less explicit work these days.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one because you have to go through that process and practice as well, and the practice has to change. And I suppose in that case, I'm going to hand over now. I'm going to move to Jakarta, to Aaron Sito, and I'll just say, as I said before, I've been a completely undisciplined moderator today, but it's fine. We are going to go over time, so it is what it is. But I hope the audience will stay with us, and I hope the speakers are fine with that because there's still lots to get through. And thank you, Ramesh. But look, Aaron, director of the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art in Macan, Museum Macan in Jakarta, formerly, as I said, the curatorial head of Asian and Pacific Art at Queensland Art Gallery, where he led an APT 8 for 8 years. He was the director of 4A. I've known him when he did his incredible Primavera exhibition. I've known Aaron for 20 years. I've known him as an artist and a curator and an incredible interlocutor and advocate and passionate representative for speaking to supporting risk and experimentation in contemporary art by culturally diverse artists. So over to you, Aaron.
Thank you, Alexi. That's very sweet of you. Well, let me take you back 20 years. I think it's interesting that no one here has really delved into wanting to redefine these terms, but we're actually pretty much revisiting. So I actually really wanted to go back 20 years to a text that was written in the year 2000. So when I think about globalization, there's one particular framework that particularly interests me, and it's an idea that Arjun Appadurai was talking about in the year 2000 about globalization from below, and the connection of these forms of globalization and the imagination. The reason why that this has been influential for me is because it's a way for us to kind of accommodate small individuals and those outside of the primary locales of global power to understand the machinations of global circulation. It's interesting because I think from this idea we understand that global formation is discriminatory. Discussions of globalization sometimes reinforce exclusion, and at the same time as it's really trying to expand our understanding of the world and our connections to it. It reinforces a limited paradigm and the concentration of power within it. Perhaps it becomes clear, a number of us have been talking about etymology, but one of the other formations of the word globalization, globalism, its etymology exists within the history of the Cold War. So what does that tell us about the role of universalism in the mid-century, and what relationship does one vector of globalization have to articulations of power? Another example that perhaps we could think about is, and perhaps it's paradoxical, is the way in which the discourse of the so-called global modern has become a mainstay of the institution. So how do these things actually fit within the Euro-American modern project? Does the global become simply a bigger territory rather than offering a complete paradigmatic shift? What is the curatorial and the institutional imagination with regard to global expansion? Another thing, one of the things that Apudori offers in his text is the practice of the imagination. And I think that for curators and for those of us working outside of the usual centers, the imagination is both provocative and it can also be really useful. Imagination has a number of particular contexts. On one hand, it gives small individuals a way to conceive their local context and to see opportunities that are different for them, so that they can imagine ways to do things that are not within their immediate local context. So this is a process by which people can choose to escape, choose to adopt or adapt, imagine and create new realities not connected to their immediate context, and seek out forms of collective life within and without national borders. There's also another powerful suggestion that Apudori makes, is that regions also imagine their own worlds. And so if we transpose this into the art world, what I think that this means is it doesn't require a powerful curator from a powerful institution to guide someone to understand their current or future reality. People can imagine the world for themselves. And in turn, which is maybe this is the responsibility of both the individual and also for the enlightened institution. And this is the ethical dimension, I think, that you kind of bring up in your notes, Alexi, is that we have to find ways to speak and write and research, which allows these spaces to find a completely different order. And we also have to find the generosity, or we have to find the skills in order to allow artists and those processes to change how we think, to change our assumptions, so that we are not simply repeating in our processes of display and our processes of organization the same, what he calls world pictures that already exist. So even though these are ideas that are 20 years old, actually 22 years old, that have been quite useful for me here in Indonesia. My role as the director has been to create an institution to develop curatorial and educational programs here in a context which hasn't had really strong museums. And one of the things that I've had to learn about are different histories and processes which do not correlate well to what I have understood through my Australian education, or what we understand through the Australian media with their perspective of the region. So I'm constantly having to hold my assumptions about what I think is going on, simply because I'm constantly in the process of education and being open about having to be re-educated in that sense. So additionally, it has led me to think about power relationships within the national context. And for me, over the last 2 years, we've been really focused on the local, the very local context. We found interest in the local context and how and this is connected to our broader concerns around diversity in archipelagic diversity, and how that this manifests within a national framework. So it's a way of really being able to open up and to shift the kind of information that we get off the Jogja, Bandung, and Jakarta axis. It's ongoing work. I think it's also complicated by the fact that we are creating an institution. But I think the role that we have and the way where we can imagine a different kind of institution for now and the future is one that allows the political and ethical edges of this kind of global discourses to be present, not to blunt them, but to actually indicate that they are present, and to find something else within this disjuncture of the local and the global, which is guided by imagination and not just institutional authority. So, yeah, I think that's it, Lex.
That's it. Just that. Look, Aaron, I think I'm going to ask you a quick question, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Nina in a moment. But I do want to talk about, can you give us an example of an exhibition or a project that you've been able to work on recently? Because I know you've been doing some really interesting work in trying to shift the expectation of what the institution is that you've been charged to lead, even with local audiences, to kind of break. And you and I have spoken a lot of times over the past year on Zoom together in an informal way about kind of ways that you've thought about a practice where you can create a more generative space of risk in collaboration with your audience. And collaboration is another tricky word because it suggests, you know, equivalence or equality or inclusion, but often strategies of collaboration are completely inequitable. And so how do you actually create kinds of spaces in which, you know, what's a project or something you've been doing that kind of speaks to that process of learning for you?
Well, one of the things we've been working on throughout the pandemic, firstly, we really had to simplify our processes because creating situations where you have got really complex environments was just actually created more uncertainty for people. So what we did is we developed I developed this project called Present Continuous, which was really, it came out of a desire to question how to do research in the current time. And so what I did is I kind of mobilized the infrastructure of the museum to help to redistribute resources to other biennales and other arts organizations across Indonesia. So there were 5 organizations that we chose to work with, which reinforced also our idea that we wanted to work outside of Java. I mean, there was 2 artists from within Java, but wanting to work outside of it. So what was going on in Papua? What does contemporary art look like in Banda Aceh? So, and the way that we did that is that we had to also defer our how we would normally research. So we chose young curators from each location to we gave them a fee, and they went out to work with the artists. There was no selection criteria. There was no selection process really for the artists that they chose. It was their decision. So I mobilized my patrons, and so that they were giving the money that they gave to that project went straight to those organizations. So it did 2 things. It was not only we understood during the pandemic that there was real risk, you know, that people's livelihoods had been completely upended, and especially probably this time last year, it was pretty dire. I think that I know that, you know, our psychological states have gone up and down over the last 2 years, but it was a way of being able to provide something solid and something real, and then at the same time the added benefit of meeting new friends and finding out how other people engage with artists and how that they're doing research on the ground. What we also said to them is that the exhibition may not happen. So you've got this so-called grant to do your research. We'd really love to see some things happen in your local area. If the exhibition happens, that's a bonus, but the exhibition is not the final outcome. So we've had talk discussions, you know, and this group have also said that I have really enjoyed the kind of cross-city conversation. We had a catch-up, and I'll leave it with this. We had a catch-up a couple of Fridays ago, and the curator from Banda Aceh, he said, well, what this project has done is it has given other young people the confidence to see that their work has some value, and that this organization already has 2 projects on its books for this year to do within their local communities. So I think, you know, we have quite a different role because we've kind of got that institutional role, but this project, I really wanted to get back to my roots and to engage again with curators and with artists and with things on the ground.
I love, and look, I'm just going to say there's a beautiful quote by Jean-Luc Godard, which I'm going to completely bastardize, but he says, it's not necessary to recreate the world, but it's essential to reimagine the world. And I think, you know, it really ties back into that process, not just of redefining, but reimagining. And I'm going to put Cosmin, Kimberly, Ramesh, and you, Aaron, on notice that I'm going to go to Nina. And then after Nina speaks, I'm just going to ask each of you, because I want to finish with each of you just with one sentence that's a reflection from today in relationship to what you've heard from the other speakers. And I think that might be a nice way to finish rather than finish with a Q&A, because I do realize we have 10 minutes left in my, as I again said before, my undisciplined moderating. So Miss Nina, I'm going to come to you, my friend, and I've known you for a long time too. You've worked in commercial sectors for Haunch of Venison, running Future Perfect with David Tay out of Singapore, but also a remarkable curator working at Carriage Works, working now at the Queensland Art Gallery, but also an independent curator. Your Tarrawara Biennial, Still Waters, which I got to see last year, was moving and beautiful and profound, and you have a deeply empathetic curatorial practice, and you've worked in such a range of different contexts, from Singapore to the UK to Australia and globally, advocating for kind of different ways of creating and supporting artistic risk and innovation. So I'll hand to you.
Thank you so much, Alexi. And I'm speaking to you from Mianjin, as Alexi said, the land of the Yugara and Turrbal peoples. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'm feeling a little unfulfilled at the moment because I have had the great pleasure of curating the video sector for the Melbourne Art Fair, but I haven't yet laid eyes on it. So I sent through the kind of floor plan a couple of days ago. I have no idea how it looks. So Alexi, please send me a photo when you have the chance. And look, thank you all for your really rich and insightful contributions. It's been such a rigorous discussion already. And I think it's clear that global and local are these two incredibly complex terms whose definitions and meanings are continually shifting and are neither sort of singular and fixed, but rather kind of multiple and variable, and so ripe for misunderstanding and manipulation. And I think each really offers a very different set of coordinates for how we might understand ideas of belonging and community and our place in the world. And they're fundamental questions for us both as individuals, but also as a kind of species. And this is becoming increasingly urgent as we face global crises like the pandemic and also like climate change. And it's an especially critical question for contemporary art and for how we understand contemporaneity in ways which take account of these kind of interlocking local and global frames and resonances, what Terry Smith calls the kind of expanding pluralism of contemporary art. And I think it was Cosmin mentioned there have been a number of kind of coinages. And I do want to mention the really awful term local, which somehow kind of claims to simultaneously embrace localism and globalism, but in reality has been little more than shorthand for parachuting art from overlooked peripheries into cosmopolitan centres, usually with very little in the way of cultural context. But if the local is understood as our kind of immediate personal experience and context, and the global is understood as our sort of broader experience and context as a species, I think the local adds depth to our perspective and the global adds breadth. And really you need both for that sort of well-rounded view. But the zone in between, or the movement between these two states and registers, can often be a place of friction and incompatibility and contestation. But I would add, and I think Aaron started to touch on this in his discussion, that I don't think there's just those two registers. It's not quite that binary. You know, there's also regional frames and national registers, and various abstractions in thinking that kind of happen along the way. And it's something I've been very kind of preoccupied in thinking about, because I think to define global and local in any meaningful way, you really have to make reference to the national, which has mediated between the local and global for so long, usually at the expense of local cultural specificities. And I've found this, I've had the kind of challenge of curating a number of national survey exhibitions of contemporary art in recent years. And so I've become very interested in how this nationally oriented form of exhibition making can be both decolonized and kind of radically reimagined for the 21st century. And I wanted to look back briefly to an exhibition I curated about 5 years ago. I was one of 5 curators on the inaugural edition of the National, which was a collaboration between the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia, and Carriage Works in Sydney. And even with its title, the National, which we deliberated about for weeks, and was in the end went with as a kind of very deliberate provocation. We wanted to sort of interrogate the value of the national frame as this lens for surveying cultural expression, and to critically examine its distortions, both kind of historical and present. Because as we've talked about, artists are working increasingly in supranational or in transnational, as Lexi said, ways, and national exhibitions are kind of completely ill-equipped to address current artistic practice in all its hybrid multiplicity. I think, historically they've certainly been sort of instrumentalized by the state and by soft power as vehicles for conveying singular and coherent and resolved notions of national identity, which we all know are a fiction. And it has, the other assumption in there is that it kind of reinforces dominant narratives, or so-called kind of official histories, often again while sublimating kind of local and cultural specificities. And so in my own curatorial practice, something that I am particularly interested in at the moment is the idea of post-national art history. And I was very fortunate enough a couple of years ago to travel up to Yirrkala in northeast Arnhem Land with a group of academics. I was the kind of rogue curator among this group of academics to do a workshop about kind of the idea of the post-national art history. And, I think it's really gaining traction. It obviously seeks to offer a transnational or global context, while at the same time acknowledging the meaning created by local inflections. And, it asks, how do we hold in kind of perfect balance and simultaneously, and actually it'll never be perfect balance. It's always an imperfect balance. But how do we hold global and local perspectives, conditions, concerns, and contexts? And a corollary question, how can the national frame be agitated and stretched into new shapes that can better accommodate marginalized voices and overlooked histories, and so better reflect the reality of our experience today? And obviously, I think we can learn so much from First Nations cultural practices and their very pre-national inspirations. They're sort of defiantly not reducible to the nation state or to its, terms or its logic, and instead so intimately tied up with the local and with a very different non-national set of coordinates for belonging and community. And yet at the same time is very transnational First Nations kind of art in terms of its collaborative practice and its mobility and how it circulates internationally. So I think that's a sort of summary of my curatorial thinking at this point in time, but I'm conscious that, we're over time, so I'll wrap up there.
I think that's fantastic, Nina. I mean, you really kind of, and I think it's really important. Climate justice was something that we didn't really speak about today, and is an important implication about when we are thinking about sort of epistemologies of global and local as well, and how we can work in more sustainable ways in order to embed and underscore and scaffold ethical principles of supporting cultural presentation and the movement and migration of objects and artworks into different audiences, but using kind of different strategies that don't have the same impact as jet fuel, and that are using more sustainable models as well, both, both within a kind of resource way, but also a strategic thinking way. What I'm going to do is quickly ask each speaker to give me one last reflection before we finish and wrap up, because there's another public program happening and these guys need to boot us off the internet. But maybe if I go Cosmin, then Aaron, then Nina, then Ramesh, and then Kimberly, I'd like to give you the last word before we finish today, and then we'll go. So Cosmin, do you have any reflection you'd like to quickly add before we finish up? Is your speaker on?
Yeah, no, well, I thank you so much. This has been like really enriching, and I think there's so many things that I've taken up from all the speakers. I mean, I was privileged to be just after Kimberly, so I already like, you know, took so much of her like framework. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of very important points that were brought by all the other speakers. And I think, yeah, one of the recurrent thing was indeed, you know, this question of redefining terms and semantics, and what are the terms that serve us best. And, you know, while we all understand that we can't reduce the complex experiences, and it's not just the complexities, that the constant transformation of the experiences that are described by this by the realm that we want to refer to, the need to sort of like apply semantics to it is, I think, a form of trying to give meaning to these complex transformations that we're subjected to. So I see that as a process of creating vocabularies that is not finalized, but it's something that I think we should all probably be engaged with.
Thank you, Cosmin, and please send our best to everybody in Nepal, and make sure you say hi to Archery. I might move, if I can, Cosmin, to Aaron.
Thanks, Alexi. There's always a pearler from you at the end, isn't there? I think, I mean, I'm just going to reiterate something from what's fascinating for me is really how do we use the imagination more, rather than relying on terms that have become really corporate and bureaucratized. What possibility, what potential are within them, using the imagination to kind of potentially reset these terms for the future.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. Nina, I might go to you actually.
Yes. Well, Alexi, I want to sort of follow on from something Cosmin said. And I think a lot about how we create, how do we create borderless experiences that are about connection rather than definition. And I think as a curator, that's often about providing safe and respectful spaces and platforms for different forms of expression, giving voice to previously obscured perspectives and histories, and providing the necessary context for others to have a really enriching encounter with them.
Thank you. Ramesh?
I think something that we've all touched on, and it's maybe another term we haven't spoken about, is responsibility. And I think the interesting thing that we've been tasked with is to actually reimagine and speculate on terms and how we can actually use them responsibly in relation to a whole interconnected web of power imbalances in the world. And I think that's what I'll be thinking about later today.
On the back of this. And Kimberly?
Sorry. Thank you, everyone. It's been such an enriching time. For me, I keep thinking about relationships. And I think, you know, going back to what I said at the beginning around, in the context of where I am within this country, and what you said, Alexia, you know, pre-contact, you know, over 300 nations, over 300 distinct areas of language groups and people's countries within a country. And this is still maintained. And within this, there are kinship lines, there are song lines that have been national for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, trade routes, marriage lines. And I think about these relationships and this Indigenous way of being and doing, and how this may be applied in an international context, and how we have our songlines and we have our kinships across the borders, across the seas. And I suppose that's a methodology or a way of thinking for me in moving forward in these global relationships that we're trying to sustain and nourish.
Thank you. I think that's such a beautiful place to finish. Thank you all for being so generous. Thank you to the audience who stayed with us. And thank you to Maf. And a round of applause to the 5 of you. And thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous. And we'll see you again soon, locally and globally. See you later. Ciao.
Thank you.